happen, that it was expected to occur. So this, in effect, is a consensus about an expectation, a prediction. I teach history of science at the University of California, and one of the things I always emphasize with my students is that we often think about scientific discovery as an event, a eureka moment, but really scientific discovery is not an event. It's a process, and it unfolds over time and often in stages. So here we see what I consider to be the first stage of the scientific consensus, the consensus about an expectation of what would happen in the future. There was also a consensus that it was not a small concern. That is to say that these changes would matter. So again, the National Research Council, writing on this question, said in 1979, the close linkage between man's welfare and the climatic regime within which his society has evolved suggests that such climatic changes would have profound impacts on human society. But the big question, the question about which there was not yet a consensus, was when. When would these changes be likely to occur? One scientist I interviewed for this project was part of a group that briefed the Carter administration on this question in 1979, and one official in the White House asked the scientist, well, when is all this going to happen? And he said, well, I don't know, maybe 40 years. And the White House official said, please come back in 39. So the surprising result was when it was not 40 years later, but it was 6. 6 years later, NASA climate modeler Jim Hansen and his team at the Goddard Institute for Space Studies, part of NASA, concluded from their scientific data that the human signal, the human fingerprint on the climate system was in fact now detectable. Hansen testified this in the US Congress, saying that he was 99% certain of this result. And it was this result, and all of the data around it, that had led in part to the creation of the IPCC in that same year. But it also led to something else. It led to a politically motivated campaign to challenge that consensus and to cast doubt upon the science and the scientists. The campaign focused on the claim that the science was unsettled, and therefore it would be premature to act to do anything about this alleged problem. As a historian, I'm interested in origins, and the shocking discovery that Eric Conway and I made was that the origins of this claim could be traced back to a small handful of people. Now today, as you all know, there's doubt about climate science being promoted in many quarters, from the Bush White House to Fox News to the pages of the Wall Street Journal, Forbes, Fortune, and many other places. But one of the most important sources of disinformation about climate change, going back to 1988, going back to this very moment when the scientific consensus first coalesced, is a think tank in Washington, D.C. named the George C. Marshall Institute. For more than 20 years now, the Marshall Institute has either denied the reality of anthropogenic climate change or denied the reality of climate change, or if they accepted that there might in fact be some global warming, denied that it was caused by people. So where did the Marshall Institute come from? And why do they promote doubt about climate science? The Marshall Institute was founded in 1984 by 3 men, all physicists, all distinguished, all prominent, all who had built their careers in the Cold War weapons and rocketry programs. So on the left we see Robert Jastrow, an astrophysicist who was head of the Goddard Institute for Space Studies, had worked on the early rocketry programs and the Apollo missions. On the right, William Nierenberg, a nuclear physicist who had worked on uranium separation for the Manhattan Project and later on many Navy-sponsored projects related to submarine-launched ballistic missiles, anti-submarine warfare, mine detection, and other Cold War military issues. And in the center, Frederick Seitz, a solid-state physicist who was a student of Eugene Wigner, often considered to be one of the fathers of the atomic bomb, because Wigner helped convince Albert Einstein to write his famous letter to FDR, imploring FDR to consider the possibility of building an atomic bomb. Seitz was also the president of the National Academy of Sciences in the early 1960s and president in the 1970s of the Rockefeller University. These 3 men had known each other for a long time. They had worked on many advisory committees, including 2 of the 3 had worked as science advisors in NATO. And in the early 1980s, they found themselves working together on an advisory panel to the Reagan administration on the question of the Strategic Defense Initiative, or what most of us know of as Star Wars. The vast majority of scientific experts opposed the Strategic Defense Initiative, arguing that it would be hugely costly, it would probably not work, And if it did work, that would be worse because it would destabilize the balance of terror which had maintained the peace during the Cold War. Over 6,500 American scientists and engineers signed a petition declaring a boycott of SDI program funds. But Jastrow, Seitz, and Nirenberg disagreed with those 6,500. And in 1984, they created the Marshall Institute to defend SDI against this overwhelming scientific consensus against it, and to promote the continuing importance of science and technology in the national defense, in part by insisting on the reality of Soviet strength and the anxiety or worry of US weakness. Now, I don't have time here to talk about all the ways in which they did this. It's a complicated story. It's described in the book. But I'll just give you my favorite example. This is an article that Robert Jastrow wrote, published in the National Review. America has 5 years left. Now, at the same time, Frederick Seitz had retired from the Rockefeller University. And he had taken on one last job, and that was working as a consultant to the R.J. Reynolds Tobacco Corporation, where he sponsored a biomedical research program, had $45 million to sponsor research that could challenge the scientific consensus on the harms of tobacco. The principal strategy of this research program was what we and others have called doubt-mongering, to fund research that could raise doubts, to fund research into other causes of cancer, to find experts who would say, well, you know, I'm not really sure, I'm a bit agnostic about this, I really don't think that the scientific jury's out, cancer is a very complicated disease. And to insist that the science was unsettled. And therefore, that because the science was unsettled, it would be irrational, premature, maybe even a little hysterical, to control tobacco use. In 1989, these two strands of the story came together. The Berlin Wall fell, rather rapidly and unexpectedly. The Soviet Union began to disintegrate. So you might have thought that these old Cold Warriors would be vindicated, that they'd be happy, that they'd open the champagne and celebrate the fact that their work had achieved exactly what they had always hoped it would, the dominance of the West over the Soviet Union. But instead of being happy, they found a new enemy. They found a new set of Reds under the bed to fight. And that new enemy was what they called environmental extremism, what they considered to be the exaggeration of environmental threats by people with a left-wing political agenda. And they applied the tobacco strategy to insist that the science was unsettled. Doubt is our product, ran the infamous memo written by one tobacco industry executive in 1969, since it is the best means of competing with the body of fact that exists in the minds of the general public. That memo, probably more than any other single document, was responsible for the conviction of the tobacco industry by the U.S. Department of Justice of conspiracy to defraud the American people under the RICO, the Racketeering and Corrupt Organizations Act. So here we see the tobacco industry consciously and deliberately following a policy of merchandising doubt. But one of the things that the tobacco industry realized early on was that for this campaign to be effective, they needed scientists. If a tobacco industry executive came up to you and said, well, you know, we don't really think tobacco is so harmful, you wouldn't be so gullible as to think that that was plausible. But if the president of the U.S. National Academy of Sciences said it, then that was a different matter. And so they actively recruited scientists to supply the doubt. And in our book, Merchants of Doubt, then we tell and explain how this same strategy then was used not just to challenge the scientific evidence of tobacco, but a whole set of environmental and public policy issues that included the harms of tobacco, both direct and secondhand, the threat of nuclear winter and this question of SDI, the reality of acid rain, the severity of the ozone hole, and of course, most famously and most significantly, the human causes of global warming. Some of these people are now involved today also in a kind of revisionist attempt to challenge the scientific evidence of the harms of the pesticide DDT. The physicists in our story cast doubt on the science behind every one of these issues. And this, for us, was like one of the other eureka moments in the story when we realized that the same names, not just the same strategy, but actually the same people, were involved in so many of these different things. At one point, we started referring to them as serial contrarians. So in every single case, the strategy was the same, to insist that the science was too uncertain to justify government action. Now, to know how they did it, you'll have to read the book. So what I'd like to spend the rest of the time this evening talking about is why they did it. Why would distinguished scientists attack the work of their own colleagues? Why would they disbelieve data published in this very same peer-reviewed journals that they themselves had published their own scientific work during their own careers? So I want to talk about why they did it. And I think that as we come to understand what the political motivations were behind this, we'll also begin to understand why it gained so much traction, especially on the right side of the political spectrum, and why the issue now is so politically polarized. So the short answer is ideology. And specifically the ideology that George Soros has given the term free market fundamentalism. The unshakable belief in the power of free markets to solve our social, economic, and political and environmental problems. So what is free market fundamentalism? Well, it's probably best understood as an end member of a broader spectrum of beliefs that go under the term or the label of modern neoliberalism. Modern neoliberalism is focused on the power of deregulation and releasing the so-called magic of the marketplace. It came to prominence in the 1980s under Margaret Thatcher in the United Kingdom and Ronald Reagan in the United States. And indeed, in Britain today, some of the most prominent climate skeptics and contrarians are people who were active in the Thatcher administration way back in 79, 80, 81. But it's not just conservatives, Tories, and Republicans, and I think this is a really important part of the story. It was promoted throughout the 1990s by in the so-called Washington Consensus, led by our president, our Democratic president, Bill Clinton, and UK Labour leader, Tony Blair. It was also promoted over the course of more than 3, almost 4 decades by the head of the Federal Reserve, Alan Greenspan. Throughout the 1990s, and really I would say up until just the last few years with the global financial collapse, there has been a bipartisan consensus in economic and policy circles on the virtues of deregulation. The intellectual roots of neoliberalism can be found primarily in the work of the Chicago economist Milton Friedman, who in 1962 published a seminal book which I highly recommend reading because it really helps explain the kind of way of thinking and psychology behind this whole story. And the crux of Friedman's argument is in his title, Capitalism and Freedom. And his argument is that capitalism and freedom are two sides of the same coin, that they are inextricably linked, that you can't have capitalism without freedom, and you can't have freedom without capitalism. So if you believe in freedom, if you believe in liberty, you must not only believe in capitalism, but you must fight to defend and protect it. Why? Well, because he argues, if you look at cases like the Soviet Union or China, mainly he was focused on the Soviet Union, he argued that for states to control markets, the only way they can do that is to control the people who are the actors in those markets. And so once you accept the need for the state intervention in the economic system, it's only a matter of time before the state will begin to control who you visit, where you work, what kind of job you take, what you think, what religion you practice, and we're on the slippery slope to tyranny. In his introduction, Friedman acknowledges his debt to the Austrian neoliberal economist Friedrich von Hayek, who in 1944 published the book Road to Serfdom. Again, the title really sums up the argument. He was a passionate opponent of social democracy in Western Europe, seeing it as part of a slippery slope towards socialism, putting us on the road to serfdom. Now, the contrarians in our story took this argument even further, arguing that environmentalism was the slippery slope to socialism, the road to serfdom. Why? Well, because many environmentalists did argue the need for the government to intervene in the marketplace for regulation of pollution like acid rain or dangerous products like tobacco. And so these men began to argue that from the regulation of acid rain or secondhand smoke, it was only a small step towards government interference in our lives more generally. This idea was articulated in many of their writings, and you can see it in a lot of contrarian, skeptical, and denier literature today, but it was probably articulated most explicitly by a fourth scientist who plays a major role in our story and who joined these campaigns in the 1980s, a man by the name of Fred Singer. Singer's personal biography was strikingly similar to the other three. Also a Cold War physicist, in fact, he was the proverbial rocket scientist. And like the others, he was a serial contrarian, engaged in campaigns to challenge the evidence of acid rain, global warming, and the ozone hole, Of our four major characters in the story, he's the only one that's still alive, and if you're interested, you can go on the internet and find out that I am a completely corrupt, incompetent, and lying historian of science. Actually, according to him, I'm not even a historian at all. So here's where the plot gets